Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The days following Mark's decision felt like a blur. He was no longer the same man who had walked into the bistro just a week ago. His mother's health, his sister's education, and the mounting weight of his father's debts had forced him to swallow his pride and accept Eleanor's proposal. It wasn't love. It wasn't even close. But for the first time in months, Mark felt like he had a chance to breathe, to make things right for his family. The next day, he arrived at Eleanor's mansion, feeling like an intruder in a world he didn't belong to. The sprawling estate was nothing like his small apartment or the cramped houses he had lived in before. The driveway stretched out before him, lined with tall, elegant trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. As he stepped out of the car, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. This was a world he'd only ever seen in movies. Eleanor was waiting for him at the grand entrance, her expression calm as ever. She gave him a nod, and without a word, led him inside. The house was grand, yet cold, with towering columns and an air of polished perfection. Everything in this house seemed untouched by human warmth. He was led to a room at the far end of the house, and Eleanor stepped aside to let him enter. "This will be your room from now on," she said in her usual composed voice. Mark stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the space. It was elegant, but it felt sterile. No personal touches, no warmth. It felt like a museum. The bed was large, with soft linens and antique furniture surrounding it. Large windows looked out over the perfectly manicured gardens. Despite the luxury, Mark felt no comfort. As he set his suitcase on the bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in the wrong place. A few hours later, they sat down for dinner in the formal dining room. Eleanor had already arranged everything with the staff, and the table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, and silver cutlery. It was the kind of meal Mark had only ever dreamed of. Eleanor, sitting across from him, casually picked up her glass of wine and took a sip. "I know this is all sudden," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But you'll get used to it. You're here to help me, and I expect you to keep your end of the deal. No distractions, no emotions." Mark felt his stomach tighten. "I'm here for the money." "That's it," he said, his voice steady, even though his mind was racing. He had already made up his mind about the arrangement. No matter how tempting this new life seemed, he wouldn't let himself get lost in it. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good," she said. "And just so we're clear, this isn't a normal marriage. We'll attend events, dinners, and public appearances. But there's no need for you to get involved with the rest of my life. This is a business transaction. Understand?" Mark nodded. Understood. The dinner passed in relative silence, with Eleanor occasionally speaking about her plans for her company and what she expected from him. Mark listened, his thoughts still swirling. As they finished the meal, Eleanor stood, signaling that it was time for the night to end. "You can explore the house if you'd like," she said, her tone casual. "I'll see you in the morning." Mark nodded, but as she turned to leave, he felt an unexpected pang of loneliness. He had always been independent, always tried to solve his problems on his own, but this felt different. He wasn't sure if he was ready to give up everything he had ever known for this cold, calculated world. That night, as Mark lay in the oversized bed, he couldn't help but think about what had brought him here. A few weeks ago, he had been a law student, barely scraping by. Now, he was living in a mansion, married to a woman he barely knew, with everything he had ever wanted hanging in the balance. But what did he really want? What was the cost of this new life? He didn't know the answer, but as he stared at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Eleanor had given him an opportunity. But was it enough to change his life for the better? Or would it only lead him further down a path of emptiness? The following week felt like a whirlwind for Mark. His new life, which had seemed so simple and clear when Eleanor had proposed their arrangement, began to feel more complicated with every passing day. The mansion, with its sprawling gardens and cold, imposing walls, was a constant reminder that he was no longer just a struggling law student. Every room he entered seemed like it was filled with expectations, with no room for mistakes. Eleanor kept her distance, only speaking to him when it was necessary. Their conversations were brief and to the point, usually about events they would attend or business arrangements that needed his presence. But despite her coldness, Mark couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her than what she was letting on. He had started to notice the little things, the way she seemed to always be working, the way her eyes would soften when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't as emotionless as she tried to appear, but she was also guarded, keeping everyone at arm's length. Mark found himself more and more intrigued by her. It was a strange feeling. Here he was, living in her world, in her home, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still an outsider. But even as his curiosity about Eleanor grew, he kept reminding himself of the deal. This wasn't about emotions or feelings, it was a contract. That was all it was. He had to remember that. A few days later, they attended their first public event together, a gala for one of Eleanor's business partners. Mark was dressed in a sharp black suit, the kind he'd never been able to afford before. The moment they entered the venue, all eyes seemed to turn toward them. Eleanor, as always, walked with confidence, her presence commanding attention. Mark followed her, trying to keep his composure, even though he couldn't help but feel out of place in such a glamorous setting. As the night wore on, Eleanor introduced him to a number of influential people in her circle, all of them complimenting her on her choice of husband. But none of them seemed to take much notice of Mark himself. He was just a prop in her world, a necessary accessory to her image. The evening passed in a blur, with Eleanor leading the way, and Mark dutifully following behind. It wasn't until later that night, as they were about to leave, that he found himself alone with Eleanor for a moment. She had just finished speaking with one of her business associates and turned toward him with a small smile. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Mark blinked, surprised. "Thanks," he replied, unsure of how to respond. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the gala was still loud in the background, but they stood there in silence, a strange tension between them. Finally, Eleanor broke the quiet. "You're adapting well," she said. "It's not easy, being thrown into this world, but you're managing." Mark nodded, but he didn't feel as if he were truly managing. He was simply going through the motions, waiting for something to happen. "I'm just doing what I have to," he said, his voice low. Eleanor studied him for a moment before speaking again. "I know this isn't easy for you. But remember, this is all temporary. Once the deal is complete, we'll both move on with our lives. You'll have everything you need. You'll be free." Her words were meant to reassure him, but somehow, they only left him feeling emptier. The idea of freedom had seemed so appealing when he was struggling to survive, but now that he was living in luxury, it felt hollow. The next morning, after a restless night of sleep, Mark found himself wandering the mansion, unsure of what to do with his day. He had no responsibilities, no tasks to complete, nothing but the silence of the house. It was a strange feeling. He could hear the distant hum of the staff working, but for the most part, he was alone in this enormous house, with nothing but his thoughts. His mind wandered to his family, to his mother and sister, and the promises he had made to them. They were counting on him, but was this the right way to fulfill those promises? Was this new life really the answer, or had he made a terrible mistake? As he sat in one of the large, empty rooms, looking out at the gardens below, Mark couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. He had everything he thought he wanted: the money, the luxury, the security, but something was missing. He wasn't sure if it was love, or if it was just a sense of purpose. All he knew was that the life he had stepped into wasn't what he had imagined. And Eleanor, despite everything, was still a mystery to him. The deal was clear business, no emotions. But with each passing day, Mark couldn't help but wonder if he was lying to himself. Was he really okay with this? Was he really okay living in a house full of wealth, but empty of meaning? Mark's days seemed to blend together in a haze of routine and emptiness. He would wake up early, eat a quick breakfast alone, and then spend hours wandering the mansion, trying to find something to occupy his mind. Eleanor was busy with her work, her meetings, and the countless events she had to attend. He never saw much of her, except when they had to show up together for some public function. As much as he tried to remind himself that this was all temporary, that it was just a business deal, the loneliness continued to creep in. He had everything he had ever dreamed of: the money, the luxury, the security, but something was missing. The house, while grand and beautiful, felt cold and empty. The staff were polite but distant, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there. It wasn't long before Eleanor invited him to one of her charity events, a high-profile gala in the city. As usual, Mark found himself playing the part of the well-dressed husband, the accessory to her image. The event was filled with wealthy socialites, business tycoons, and celebrities, all of them offering polite smiles and hollow compliments. Eleanor, as always, was in control, charming everyone she spoke to, her elegance and poise undeniable. Mark, on the other hand, felt more out of place than ever. He could barely keep up with the conversations, not knowing anything about the high-powered deals being discussed or the expensive brands being flaunted. He spent most of the evening standing beside Eleanor, nodding along, trying not to look too much like a fish out of water. But when the night drew to a close, Eleanor surprised him. Instead of retreating to her private quarters, she turned to him as they made their way out of the venue. "Let's take a walk," she said, her tone unusually soft. Mark, caught off guard, nodded and followed her outside. The cool night air was a welcome change from the stuffy ballroom. As they walked down the quiet street, the sound of their footsteps was the only noise breaking the silence. For the first time since he had moved into the mansion, Mark felt a sense of peace. The chaos of the gala was far behind, and here, on the empty streets, he was alone with Eleanor, away from the eyes of the public. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know," Eleanor said, breaking the silence. "I know this is all new for you. You don't have to be the perfect husband. I'm not asking for that." Mark looked at her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. "I'm just trying to get through this," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I don't know what you expect from me." Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him. The streetlights cast a soft glow on her face, and for the first time, Mark saw something more than the controlled, distant woman he had come to know. She looked human. "I don't expect anything from you, Mark," she said softly. "This is just a deal, but I don't want you to feel like you have to hide who you are. I didn't ask you to be someone you're not. If you want to go back to your life after this is over, you can. It's up to you." Mark's mind raced as he processed her words. He had been so focused on the idea of the deal, on the business side of things, that he hadn't stopped to consider what he truly wanted. Eleanor's words lingered in his mind long after they had returned to the mansion. Was this really just a deal? Or had something deeper begun to take root? He couldn't deny that he had started to care about her, in his own way. But that wasn't part of the plan. He had promised himself he wouldn't get emotionally involved. The next few days passed in a blur of business meetings, events, and endless formalities. Mark went through the motions, his mind occupied with his family and the promises he had made to them. He knew that Eleanor had given him everything he needed: money, security, a future. But it was all so hollow. No matter how much he tried to push his feelings away, they kept coming back. He found himself thinking about Eleanor more than he should have, wondering if she was as lonely as he felt. The night before another big gala, Mark found himself standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit. As he straightened his tie, he realized how different he felt now compared to the man who had walked into Eleanor's life a few weeks ago. He was no longer just the desperate law student. He had become someone else, someone who had everything he could have ever dreamed of, but at the same time, felt completely empty. When Eleanor walked into the room, looking as stunning as ever, Mark couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was. But it wasn't just her appearance that caught his attention, it was the way she held herself, the way she commanded the room without saying a word. "You look good," she said with a smile. Mark gave her a small nod, though he wasn't sure how to respond. He didn't know what he was feeling anymore, but he knew one thing for certain: things were changing, and he wasn't sure where they were headed. As they walked into the gala together, their hands brushed briefly. It was a fleeting moment, but for some reason, it felt like more. Mark wasn't sure what this arrangement between them had become, but he couldn't deny the growing connection. A connection he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The gala was in full swing, with elegant chandeliers casting a warm glow over the bustling crowd. Mark stood by Eleanor's side, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the sea of faces. He had been to several of these events now, always standing quietly next to Eleanor, the perfect accessory to her commanding presence. But tonight, something was different. As they made their way through the crowd, Mark felt a shift within himself. The connection between him and Eleanor was no longer just a business arrangement. It was something more, though he couldn't quite put it into words. Eleanor, as always, moved through the room with grace, exchanging pleasantries with guests, shaking hands, and speaking with ease. But when their eyes met across the room, there was an unspoken understanding between them. A flicker of something that neither of them could deny. Mark had been careful to keep his distance, to remind himself that this was just a deal, that there could be no emotions involved. But that promise was growing harder to keep. The more time he spent with Eleanor, the more he realized how complicated his feelings were becoming. As the evening went on, Mark found himself at the edge of the ballroom, his back to the wall as he watched Eleanor across the room. She was in the middle of a conversation with one of her business partners, laughing softly at something he said, her eyes sparkling with amusement. For a moment, Mark felt a pang in his chest. He had seen that look in her eyes before, but not directed at him. It made him feel like he was still an outsider in her world, even after everything they had been through together. He turned away, his gaze drifting to the other guests, but his mind kept returning to Eleanor. He couldn't help but wonder, did she feel the same way? Was she starting to care about him, or was he just another pawn in her carefully constructed world? As the night wore on, the crowd began to thin out, and Eleanor appeared at Mark's side once again. She had changed into a simpler dress for the evening, one that looked more comfortable than the usual designer gowns she wore. Her hair was slightly tousled, and for the first time in a long while, she looked less like the powerful CEO and more like a woman who had been caught off guard by something. "Are you okay?" Eleanor asked, her voice soft, as if she had noticed the far-off look in his eyes. Mark nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just tired," he replied, though the truth was, he wasn't sure what he was feeling. "I think I'm ready to head home." Eleanor didn't argue, simply nodding and leading him toward the exit. The ride back to the mansion was quiet, the tension between them thick in the air. When they finally arrived, Eleanor didn't immediately retreat to her room, as she often did. Instead, she turned to Mark, her gaze intense. "You've been distant tonight," she said quietly, her voice tinged with something Mark couldn't place. He opened his mouth to respond but found he couldn't quite find the words. Instead, he shrugged. "I don't know. It's just been a long night." Eleanor stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Mark," she said, her voice softer now, "I didn't bring you into my life just to be a part of the background. I may not have asked for love, but I didn't expect us to be strangers either." Mark's heart raced at her words. It was as if she had just confirmed everything he had been feeling but hadn't dared to say. He had tried to keep his distance, tried to remind himself that he was only here for the money, for the security. But hearing her say that made it feel all too real. She wasn't just a business partner. She was more. And that scared him. "I didn't want this to happen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to get involved. Eleanor didn't say anything at first. Instead, she reached out, gently brushing a lock of hair from his face. The touch was tender, and it sent a shock through Mark's chest. You can't control everything, she said softly. Life doesn't work that way. Neither of us expected this, but maybe that's what makes it real. Mark looked at her, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so much time fighting his emotions, trying to stick to the deal they had made. But here, standing in front of her, he felt like everything was shifting. He wasn't sure what the future held or how this story would end, but he knew one thing for sure: the line between business and emotion had blurred, and neither of them could turn back now. Eleanor gave him a small, knowing smile before she turned and walked down the hallway. Mark stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He didn't know what to make of this. All he knew was that things had changed. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first walked into this mansion, and neither was she. Maybe they never had been. The days that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between him and Eleanor. The walls of the mansion, which had once seemed so grand and impersonal, now felt like they were closing in on him. The tension was palpable, but neither of them addressed it directly. Eleanor kept her distance, though not in the cold, distant way she had before. It was different now. There was something more complicated in the air, an undercurrent of vulnerability that neither of them was ready to face. Mark tried to focus on his responsibilities, the ones he had promised to fulfill when he first entered this arrangement. He was still living in Eleanor's world, attending events, meeting with her business associates, and playing the part of the perfect husband. But inside, it was as if a battle was raging within him. He had entered this arrangement to solve his family's problems, to escape the weight of debt and responsibility. But now, in the midst of all the wealth and luxury, he was beginning to realize that the price of security was far higher than he had anticipated. His emotions, which he had tried so hard to suppress, were starting to surface. He found himself watching Eleanor more closely, noticing the little things about her: the way her eyes softened when she spoke about her business, or the way she'd occasionally look lost in thought when she thought no one was watching. She wasn't just the cold, calculated woman he had first met. She was someone more complex, someone with fears and doubts that she kept buried beneath a polished exterior. One evening, after another business dinner, Eleanor invited him to join her for a drink in her private study. It was an intimate setting, one that felt worlds away from the grand, public events they usually attended. Mark had never been to her study before, and as they sat down, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The room was lined with bookshelves, filled with volumes of business reports, philosophy, and art. A soft glow from a desk lamp illuminated Eleanor's face as she poured them both glasses of wine. For the first time in a long time, she seemed relaxed, her shoulders no longer stiff with the weight of her responsibilities. "You know, I've spent most of my life building this empire," Eleanor said, her voice quieter than usual. "But there's always been something missing. I thought that if I could just control everything, I could make it all work. But now, I'm not so sure." Mark looked at her, unsure of how to respond. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to hear it. But something about the way she said it made him want to listen. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice gentle. Eleanor took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I thought I needed control. I thought I needed to be this perfect CEO, this perfect woman who never showed weakness. But sometimes, I wonder if it's all worth it. I've spent so much time focusing on success, on building something that no one can take away from me, but in the process, I've lost something important." Mark swallowed hard, his heart suddenly racing. He could feel the weight of her words, and for the first time, he wondered if their arrangement was about more than just business. "What have you lost?" he asked, his voice low. Eleanor smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I've lost the ability to trust anyone," she said softly. "I've built this world around me, but in doing so, I've pushed everyone away. Even you, Mark." Her words hung in the air, and Mark's chest tightened. He had always thought that Eleanor was the one who had it all together, that she was invincible. But now, in this moment, he saw the cracks in her armor. She wasn't the perfect woman he had thought her to be. She was just like him, flawed, uncertain, and searching for something more. Eleanor, Mark began, his voice steady, you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to push everyone away. She looked at him, her eyes softening for the first time in a long while. I don't know how to stop, she whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. I don't know how to let go of this control I've fought so hard for. Mark reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. The touch was gentle, but it sent a jolt of electricity through both of them. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Finally, Eleanor broke the silence. Maybe I'm not ready to change, she said, her voice quiet. But I don't want to keep pretending either. Mark sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He didn't know where this was heading, didn't know if Eleanor was ready to take the leap, or if he was. But in that moment, he realized something: this wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. There was something real between them, something they couldn't ignore, no matter how hard they tried. The days following their conversation in Eleanor's study felt like a turning point. Mark couldn't shake the weight of her words, and he found himself lost in thought more than usual. Eleanor had been honest with him for the first time since they met, and her vulnerability, the cracks in her armor, made him see her in a different light. It was clear that they both had been living in their own worlds, each trying to hide from something deeper. For Mark, this arrangement had started out as a way to fix his family's financial struggles, to escape the burden of his past. But now, with every passing day, he was beginning to question everything. Was this truly what he wanted? The mansion, the wealth, the security, it all felt like it was built on a lie. Eleanor's walls had come down, and his own emotional defenses were starting to crumble. He couldn't pretend anymore that this was just about the deal. That night, after another long day of meetings and events, Mark found himself alone in the library. The quiet of the room, the soft glow of the lamps, gave him the space to think. He was turning the pages of a book he hadn't been able to focus on, his mind wandering back to Eleanor. The thought of her feeling as lost as he had, hiding behind a facade of power, made his heart ache. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, Eleanor appeared in the doorway. She was dressed casually, a rare sight in the midst of their busy, polished lives. Mark, she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Can we talk? He looked up, nodding, and gestured for her to sit. Of course. Eleanor stepped into the room and sat down across from him. Her eyes were tired, but there was a certain determination in her gaze. I've been thinking, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. About everything. About us. Mark felt his heart skip a beat. He knew where this was going, and part of him wasn't sure he was ready to face it. Eleanor. He started, but she held up a hand, stopping him. No, she said, shaking her head slightly. Let me say this. I've been so focused on control for so long, trying to make everything perfect, that I forgot what it's like to be real. To feel something. And now, I'm scared. Mark's chest tightened. He could see it in her eyes. She was struggling with the same thing he was. The wall she had built around herself was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, Eleanor was allowing herself to feel the weight of her emotions. I don't know what to do with all of this, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to let go of everything I've built, the life I've created. But I know that I don't want to keep going like this, pretending everything is fine. Mark's heart went out to her. He understood her more than he had ever realized. They were both running from something, and now they were both standing at the edge, unsure of how to take the next step. You don't have to do it alone, he said softly. I don't know if I can fix this, or if we can fix everything that's broken. But I'm not going anywhere. Eleanor looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. It wasn't the smile of a CEO or a businesswoman, it was the smile of someone who was starting to let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let someone in. I don't know what this is, she said, her voice raw. I don't know if it's love or just two people trying to survive, but I don't want to lose it. I don't want to lose you. Mark reached across the table, taking her hand in his. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. "You're not going to lose me," he said firmly. "We're both in this, whether we know where it's headed or not." There was a long silence between them, filled only by the sound of their breathing. Mark knew that they had crossed a line. The line between business and emotion had finally disappeared, and whatever happened next, they would have to face it together. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm scared, Mark," she whispered. "I don't know if I can let go." "You don't have to let go all at once," Mark replied softly. "We'll take it one step at a time." For the first time, Eleanor seemed to relax, a small weight lifting off her shoulders. The world they had been hiding from seemed a little less intimidating. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The following weeks felt like a slow unraveling, a shift from what Mark and Eleanor had both built their lives around. The house that had once felt cold and empty now seemed a little warmer, as if the walls themselves were starting to breathe with the life they were allowing each other to create. Eleanor had been less distant, though still reserved. She no longer kept herself locked away in her office for hours on end, and they spent more time together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about things that didn't have anything to do with business. But despite this newfound closeness, neither of them could escape the truth that lingered beneath the surface. They were still living in a deal, no matter how much they tried to ignore it. Eleanor had made it clear that this arrangement was always meant to be temporary, a stepping stone to something more permanent for both of them, but as the days passed, the lines between their business arrangement and something deeper began to blur. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Mark found himself waiting for Eleanor in the study. He had learned to give her space, to let her handle her business as she needed. But tonight, something felt different. Eleanor walked into the room, her eyes meeting his as she closed the door behind her. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but this time, neither of them shied away from it. "We need to talk," Eleanor said softly, her voice low and serious. Mark looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. "What's on your mind?" he asked, though he already had an inkling of where this conversation might lead. Eleanor took a deep breath, her gaze steady. "I've been thinking about everything. About us. And I think it's time we make a decision." Mark's stomach tightened. He had known this moment was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. The truth was, he didn't know what he wanted. The fear of being trapped in a contract, the idea of love that had begun to creep into their arrangement, wasn't sure if he was ready to embrace it. "What kind of decision?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "I know we started this as a business deal. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like just a deal. And I think it's time we either commit to this, to what we're building, or we walk away. No more pretending. No more keeping things in the shadows." Mark's heart raced as her words hit him. It felt like the world had stopped, and in that silence, he realized that this wasn't just about business anymore. It wasn't just about the mansion, the security, the deal. It was about him and Eleanor, the two of them, standing at a crossroads. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: couldn't walk away. Not anymore. He looked at her, his voice filled with emotion. "I don't want to walk away," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I don't want to pretend anymore, Eleanor. I'm in this, for real. For us. I don't know what this is yet, but I don't want to let it go." Eleanor's face softened, and for the first time, Mark saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. The touch was simple, but it felt like a promise. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said, her voice steady. "No more hiding. No more pretending. We take this step, and we do it together." Mark nodded, feeling a weight lift from his chest. The tension between them had finally broken, and though they both knew there would still be challenges ahead, for the first time, they were ready to face them. Together. As they stood there, hands intertwined, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt full of possibilities. Weeks passed since that pivotal conversation between Mark and Eleanor. They had finally stopped pretending, stopped hiding behind their roles. The walls that had once separated them, walls built from business deals and unspoken fears, had crumbled, piece by piece. For the first time, Mark felt like he was truly part of something, not just the bystander to someone else's world. Eleanor, too, seemed different. Her guarded demeanor had softened, and while she still carried the weight of her empire, she no longer wore it like armor. They were navigating this new chapter together, and though neither of them knew exactly where it would lead, they were no longer afraid to find out. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped low behind the sprawling gardens of the mansion, Mark stood by the window of their shared office. He was looking out at the horizon, lost in thought, when Eleanor walked in. She had a gentle smile on her face, one that Mark hadn't seen often in the past. It was a smile that wasn't just for appearances, but one that radiated warmth and affection. She stood beside him, her presence calming. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft. "About everything. About us." Mark turned toward her, his heart racing. This wasn't the kind of conversation he expected to have. But after everything they had been through, he knew it was coming. "What have you been thinking?" he asked, his voice steady but full of emotion. Eleanor took a deep breath, as if gathering her thoughts. "I think we've both come a long way," she said slowly. "From where we started, from who we were when we first met." She paused, her gaze meeting his. "We're not the same people we were. And I think I'm ready to make this real." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had never heard her speak like this before, so open, so vulnerable. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was something more, something that had grown between them without either of them fully realizing it until now. He took a step closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You mean us? This?" Eleanor nodded, her eyes softening. "Yes. Us. This isn't just about a deal anymore. It's about two people who, despite everything, found something real." Mark felt his chest tighten as the words sank in. He had spent so long holding himself back, unsure of what was possible between them. But here, in this moment, he realized that he didn't want to hold back anymore. "I want this too," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "I don't want to let this go, Eleanor. I don't want to lose what we have." Eleanor smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You won't," she said softly. "I promise you won't." They stood there for a long moment, just holding each other's gaze, knowing that they had crossed a threshold together. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer seemed like a dark, daunting road. It felt like a path they could walk together, side by side, no matter what it held. As they shared a quiet embrace, Mark realized that the life he had built, the one he had thought would bring him all the answers, wasn't the answer at all. What he needed, what they both needed, was each other. Eleanor had given him the opportunity to see beyond the surface, beyond the wealth and the power. And in return, he had shown her that there was more to life than control and perfection. Together, they had found something real. And that was all that mattered. The mansion no longer felt cold and empty. It felt like home. Mark smiled as he pulled Eleanor closer, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had found something worth holding on to. And that was enough.